One single meeting, held in a bunker outside Moscow in the freezing winter of 1941, was the only thing standing between the world you know and a world ruled from Berlin. Had a handful of generals made different choices in those few months, the map of the entire planet, the language you might be speaking, and the very idea of who won the 20th century could look completely different today. To understand how close this came to happening, we first need to understand what actually happened and just how thin the margin really was. By the autumn of 1941, Nazi Germany controlled more of Europe than any single power had held since the days of Napoleon. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. Poland, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, and the Balkans had all been absorbed into the Reich's orbit. Hitler's June forces, the Wehrmacht, stood at the gates of Moscow itself, close enough that German officers reported being able to see the spires of the Kremlin through their field glasses. The Soviet government had already begun evacuating its archives and gold reserves eastward, bracing for the capital to fall. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel's forces were pushing British lines back toward Egypt and the Suez Canal, the lifeline of the British Empire. Japan, Germany's ally, was preparing a strike that would soon pull the United States into the war. On paper, the Axis powers controlled more territory, more industrial output relative to their population, and more momentum than anyone watching from London or Washington could have predicted just 2 years earlier. But beneath that momentum were cracks that history now shows were already forming. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, had been delayed by weeks due to a detour into the Balkans to rescue a failing Italian campaign in Greece. Those lost weeks meant the German army marched into the brutal Russian winter without proper cold weather equipment, a logistical gap that would prove catastrophic. This is the real point of divergence, the hinge on which an entire alternate timeline turns. Imagine instead that Mussolini's forces had succeeded in the Balkans without German intervention, or that Hitler had simply ignored Italy's struggles and launched Barbarossa in May as originally planned, a full 5 weeks earlier than the actual invasion date. In this alternate timeline, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow in early October instead of December. While the ground is still hard and the roads still passable, the extra 5 weeks allow for a final push before the autumn rains turn the landscape into the thick mud the Germans called Rasputitsa, and crucially, before the brutal cold sets in that historically froze German fuel lines, locked up weapons, and left soldiers without winter coats. Stalin, already rattled by the speed of the German advance and the chaos following Operation Barbarossa's real-world success in destroying entire Soviet armies in the opening months, makes the decision to relocate the government east of the Ural Mountains rather than risk capture. Moscow falls in this scenario, not as a final death blow to Soviet resistance, but as a devastating symbolic and logistical loss, cutting off critical rail lines that connected the Soviet war machine. Here's where the story gets more complicated than most people assume, and this is the first major turn. A common assumption is that the fall of Moscow would mean the end of the war on the Eastern Front. But historians who study Soviet industrial capacity point out that much of the USSR's war production had already been relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, to cities like Chelyabinsk, nicknamed Tankograd, where T-34 tanks rolled off assembly lines far out of reach of German bombers. Even with its capital captured, the Soviet Union possessed something Germany never fully accounted for: depth. The country was simply too vast, too cold, and too industrially decentralized for a single symbolic victory to end the resistance. In this alternate scenario, the war in the East doesn't end with the fall of Moscow. It transforms into a grinding, years-long campaign deeper into Soviet territory, stretching German supply lines even further than they already were historically, and exposing the Wehrmacht to the same resource shortages that doomed the real invasion, just on a delayed timeline. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the alternate timeline doesn't change a crucial fact: the United States. Even in a scenario where Germany achieves greater early success against the Soviets, nothing in the historical records suggests that Imperial Japan would alter its decision to strike Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Japan's calculus was driven by its own need for oil and resources in the Pacific, largely independent of events in Russia. This means the United States still enters the war, still begins converting its enormous industrial base, the largest in the world at the time, into the so-called arsenal of democracy. American shipyards, factories, and farms, untouched by bombing and fully mobilized, begin producing war material at a scale neither Germany nor Japan could ever hope to match. This is the second major turn in our alternate history. Even a Germany that captures Moscow is still fighting a war of attrition against a coalition whose combined industrial output dwarfs its own. Let's continue building this alternate world forward in time. By 1943, in this scenario, Germany controls a deeper swath of Soviet territory, including critical oil fields in the Caucasus region that, in our real timeline, German forces nearly reached but never fully secured. Controlling these oil fields solves one of Germany's most persistent real-world problems: fuel shortages that crippled its tanks and aircraft in the actual war. With secured oil, German panzer divisions and the Luftwaffe operate with far greater range and endurance. This buys the right critical time and resources. In Western Europe, German occupation forces, no longer needing to divert as many troops to the Eastern Front, are able to fortify the Atlantic coastline more heavily than in our timeline. The D-Day invasion, when American, British, and Canadian forces eventually attempt their crossing of the English Channel, faces a far more entrenched and better supplied defense. This brings us to the long-term, world-altering consequences. The kind of changes that would ripple across generations. If German defenses in Western Europe hold longer, or even repel an Allied invasion entirely, the war in Europe could stretch on for years beyond its actual 1945 conclusion. A prolonged stalemate creates space for one of the most chilling possibilities in this alternate history: a race to develop nuclear weapons that doesn't end the same way it did in reality. In our actual timeline, the United States developed the atomic bomb first, through the Manhattan Project, partly because German nuclear research was hampered by the regime's own purges of Jewish scientists, many of whom fled to America and Britain and contributed directly to Allied nuclear research. In this alternate scenario, a Germany that's winning, that retains more scientific talent, and that has more resources to dedicate to advanced weapons research, narrows that gap. Historians who study this counterfactual generally agree it's unlikely Germany would have won the race to a working bomb outright, given how far behind German nuclear physics actually was. But a longer, more resourced war effort could plausibly bring Germany within reach of other advanced weapons technology, like improved rocket programs building on the V2, or jet aircraft fielded in far greater numbers than the limited squadrons that appeared late in the real war. Now here's the third and most important turn in this story, the one that connects everything back to a deeper truth about how empires actually fail. Even in a timeline where Germany holds Moscow, secures Caucasus oil, and repels or delays an Allied invasion, the regime's own internal structure carries the seeds of its own collapse. Nazi Germany's economy, even in this stronger alternate scenario, was built on plunder rather than sustainable production, stripping occupied territories of resources rather than developing them. Its ideology demanded the brutal subjugation of the very populations whose labor and resources it depended on, particularly across Eastern Europe, which actively undermined the loyalty and productivity of the territories it controlled. A regime that murders or enslaves the people producing its food, fuel, and weapons is, by its own design, building an empire that cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Combine that with a United States whose industrial capacity, by the mid-1940s, dwarfed that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, and the picture becomes clearer. Even a Germany that wins more battles, holds more territory, and delays defeat by years is still fighting a war it likely cannot win in the long run, because the deeper structural and economic realities never actually changed. This doesn't mean an alternate Allied victory would look anything like the real one. A war that stretches into the late 1940s, possibly with both sides racing toward more advanced weapons, would leave a Europe even more devastated than the one history actually produced. The political map that emerged after 1945, the division of Germany, the rise of two competing superpowers, the formation of organizations like NATO. All of it would be reshaped by a longer, bloodier conflict. Some historians who explore this counterfactual suggest that a prolonged war could have shifted the balance of post-war power even further toward the United States, since American territory remained untouched by the fighting, while European and Soviet industrial capacity would have been even more thoroughly destroyed by additional years of warfare. Others argue a longer war increases the odds of nuclear weapons being used on European soil rather than in the Pacific, an outcome almost too catastrophic to fully calculate. What this exercise in alternate history really reveals isn't that Germany was ever truly close to permanent victory. The deeper structural disadvantages were always there. What it reveals is how fragile the actual outcome was in its details. How a 5-week delay in launching an invasion, a decision made by one man in a matter of days, could have added years of suffering and reshaped the boundaries of the modern world, even if the final result may have remained the same. History often gets remembered as inevitable, as though the world we live in was always going to happen exactly this way. But the closer you look at moments like the autumn of 1941, the more you realize how much of what we now call history was actually decided by chance, weather, timing, and the choices of a handful of people who had no idea just how much was riding on their decisions. So the next time you look at a world map and take its borders for granted, consider this. The line between the world you live in and a radically different one may have come down to a few degrees of temperature, a few weeks of delay, and a decision made in a bunker that most people have never even heard of. What does that tell us about how much of our own present moment is being shaped right now by choices just as small?